let's talk about stereo versus mono and how we use it in mixing. There's a couple of great features and things that we're able to do with stereo. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to open up this session, one last call, and focus on an area where the drums begin to play. And if we look at the drum tracks, just to get a sense of what's going on, each track in this session with the drums is being multi-tracked at the same time. So it's a singular pass. And all of them are working together, but they all have different representation inside of what they should be doing in the stereo field. And some of them, their whole job is to be mono. But there's a couple things we have to look at about that. Let's just start from the beginning. What we see oftentimes is the kick drum typically is mono, along with the snare. Those particular images are not just mono, but they run down the center of the mix. So mono really specifies it's a one-channel source. Well, if you go look at most of the sources in here, these are one-channel sources, meaning like the source that's being played, like the snare, has one mic and it's a singular source. So we actually have to think about what's the source doing. How many channels does the source have? And then second to that, what is the output goal? Is that output goal that it goes in mono and it comes out mono, or it goes in mono and two things could happen. Either it pairs with some other mono track and together combined they make a stereo image, which is what happens in the drums with a combination of things like Tom 1 and Tom 2, or overhead left and right, or we could run them down a reverb processor that actually takes that mono channel and splits it to a stereo left right. So let's take a look at just a couple of things with that in regards to that. And real simply, we could start with the drums, but if we kind of just cycle through them and you kind of listen to what's happening with their panning. Now I actually have the Air Stereo Width device up. It's a plugin that allows us to either make the image wider or more narrow or more mono, just to show off what happens after we're done with this and we have it in a big stereo as we shrink it down. So let's take a look. First, we're going to start off with some kick. Oh, sorry, some guitars going on in there. There we go. Now, mono down the middle. These are all mono sources, but they're being mixed right towards center. And if I open these up, that all the mono stuff, kick and snare, and then I squish that mono path. Technically, right now, what we're listening to is multi-mono, which means they're down the middle and the same information that exists on the left channel in stereo exists on the right. So technically, it's a stereo output, but the same information is on the left as it is on the right. So essentially, it represents a multi-mono. So technically, we're listening in mono, which means if I were to go change this width, we should hear no difference. The width from stereo to mono on the output, we should hear no difference, but let's go listen. It also means if I try to go wider than the 100% panning, we still got the same sound. So now let's go ahead and inject something that is captured in stereo. So the overheads of the drums are positioned above the drums left and right, and they are a stereo pair. Same source, same recording pass, but they're a stereo version of the pair. And again, I'm going to leave this at 100% just to take a listen, and I'll add all these other things in. So that's the mono version down the center, going back to 100%. Now, pay close attention to what you hear where. Let's listen for it. So this is just overhead mic. It's actually, there's no plug-in processing on it, so it's untreated. But let's take a listen to it and try to decide what are we hearing of the drums that's different in the left than is happening in the right. Okay, so we're hearing a little bit of that hi-hat off to the left, tom 1 a little bit off to the left, and tom 2 a little bit off to the right. But I mean a little bit. It's not super wide yet, but there is a sense of wideness. But again, it's just not clearly defined. And that's part of the role of when we actually set up the panning on the individual tracks to identify and very, very clearly bring that out. So first off, if we bring the kick and the snare back in, they're going dead center, so they're going to emphasize the middle. By emphasizing the middle, by showing us where middle is, it's going to show us how wide left and right can be. So let's take a listen to that. And I'm going to slowly bring in elements that belong on the left first, and then bring in elements that belong on the right. Let's flip back to mono. One thing that you'll notice immediately is the strokes between the tom 1 hits and the tom 2 hits, which are that frotatatum kind of vibe, are very together, and they actually sound like they could be coming from the same drum when they're put to mono or set to that center point. As soon as we open that width back up to full stereo, you notice that the vibe is very open and you can hear the difference between which one's which. And that's part of the election between like why we might want them wider or why we might not want them as wide. Is should they be acting as a unit? Are they too separated that it doesn't feel good? Or should we be looking at making sure that they're nice and wide so we can articulate each of them one from another? Again, right now, there are no plugins on these tracks, so we're looking at raw tracks just as they were recorded. So let's listen to that again. Now, what's also cool about this, and I'm just going to zoom in on this so you can see it. What's great about the stereo width that I think is also an important piece to note. In your mix, your low frequencies, the goal for low frequencies is for low frequencies to be centered. And for the higher, as you begin to move upward from your sub and your low frequencies into your mids and your highs, for them to be wide. Like they feel wonderful that way. And there's a handful of reasons why that should work and the reason that principle exists. One is, if we think about who is in your sub and your low frequencies, it's not a long list of people. We're literally talking kick drum, bass, maybe some sort of sub drop, a low synth, maybe a low piano. If you have strings, maybe bass and cello. But outside of that, the low end of guitar starts to get into that low mid. But those aren't usually things that you track over and over, meaning most people aren't going in and putting, 20 layers of kick drum in. Normally if they do that, they're making it a combined one kick drum and it really represents just one kick sound. Whereas vocals are getting stacked all day, but so you'll have like a lead with a double and maybe some extra parts for the verses, and then once you get to the chorus, you got a stack of like 30 vocals. Well, the vocals all exist in the mid and the high, so they absolutely need more space to fit into that mix because it's so many channels being shot down that two-channel stereo path, where the low end really has to be represented singularly in the center so that the mix stays balanced. Because again, most of the time in most mixes, there's only a few things. In this mix particularly, there's only kick, low tom, bass, and there's no synth. There's nothing else going down there. There's just some guitars, but we don't want the guitars to get too deep. The other thing is when they're firing off the subwoofer channel is typically represented in a mono form. And so you don't normally have unless you're in, a theater that has the 0.2 version where there's multiple subs, like a left and a right sub path. Most of the time when you're listening to the sub frequencies and low frequencies, they're represented in a single path on the sub. And anywhere you put it in that room, it's going to rock that room, but it's doing it as a center channel. So you don't necessarily want to have information missing from it that would represent a left-right channel. You want everything that's on the low end running through that sub. That's supposed to be. And that's what we're about to look at here, because in this process, we are allowed to elect which frequencies are wider than others. So going back to 100% on the main, let's take a look at that, and let's get all of these down to mono. So now all of them should be represented as mono, even though the width is 100%. Let's take a listen to this mix, and I'm going to roll specific frequencies up as we go. Now, although it felt good to have some of that tom action a little wide on the low end, it's also going to be handled in the mid and the high. So let's take a listen to a little bit of a blend of those. And anytime we move past 100%, that width is essentially being adjusted in the stereo left right. So we could get wider if we wanted to have it feel wider up high. So let's listen. The only thing I would say would be better than this is some plugins actually give you the ability to decide where those crossover points are in terms of that width. I feel like, to me, it seems like you get a little bit more definition out of not having the mids all the way at 100% in there when we're just looking at the drums. Now, we're actually going to go look at a few other things. So let's actually move away from this. I'm going to bypass this. Let's talk about a couple of other things in terms of stereo and in stereo use. If we were to look at the guitars that are happening here, well, a couple things are happening. Of course, everybody's kind of going nuts here. So maybe let's go to the front section. This, to me, has to be just one of the more exciting components of the song is what's happening in the front end. Let's see which parts we can extract here. These should be stereo guitars. What makes these stereos is a little different. So it's oftentimes the way I record is I'll run two different amps, and one amp represents my left channel off my delay pedal from the guitar, and the other one represents my right channel off my delay pedal on the guitar. So when we're looking at these, we're usually looking at a left representation as like a separate amp with a bit of a different tone, but it's the same performance. Like I'm playing it the same, I'm not doubling my performance. I'm literally playing it once, but it's getting split to two channels. The other thing you also notice is in just the blend here, what I also do with that typically in the mix is I might look at those levels and go, okay, left versus right, either they're going to be balanced or we need to shift them a little bit. And so that's kind of what you're going to see. So let's take a listen. I'm going to take them back to mono.